All right, guys, today we are back and we're talking about the Prohibition of the 1920s and early 30s. This is such a fascinating topic. It's one of my favorites because it touches on so many facets of American life. So let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to see is that the 18th Amendment and the law that kind of precedes that's called the Volstead Act. But the 18th Amendment is going to pass and it's going to ban the manufacture, transportation, distribution, sale, possession of alcohol. You are not allowed to have it. You're not allowed to drink it. It is all of a sudden we are a completely dry nation. No alcohol anywhere. And the interesting thing here is that that means that overnight the United States does not just stop drinking alcohol. In fact, the opposite is true. We just overnight become a nation of lawbreakers. We get really, really good at dealing with some of these things. In fact, consumption of alcohol is actually going to go up during Prohibition. So what was started in the Progressive Era as a way to kind of curb alcohol use and deal with many of the social problems that they thought had their roots in alcohol and drunkenness and so forth, it really has the opposite effect. During this period, we are going to see the rise of organized crime, because if people aren't going to stop drinking alcohol, if they still want to get it, then there needs to be massive distribution available in the United States. And if it's illegal, it has to be done by criminals. So what we'll see is the growth of the underworld. And this is an image here of Al Capone, a notorious gangster from Chicago in the 1920s. And he was, in many cases, solely responsible for a lot of the distribution of alcohol around major parts of the country. But this is a pretty significant thing because now not only do we have alcohol that we have to contend with, but very powerful organized crime syndicates as well. We'll see them rise. In fact, there is a very famous situation in Chicago where Al Capone is kind of at war with Bugsy Moran and his gang over control of the alcohol industry. And they kind of are warring back and forth. Well, Al Capone puts an exclamation point on the thing by raiding, one of Bugsy Moran's warehouses. He sends a few guys in dressed as cops. Now, cops were notoriously on the take. That was part of doing business. You paid them off, you gave them alcohol, they turned a blind eye. So Moran's guys' antennas are not really raised when a few guys dressed as cops come in and put them against a wall to pat them down. But when these guys have others that come and join them with Tommy guns and just splatter them all over the wall, this is a little different thing, right? This makes the newspaper. It's considered the St. Valentine's Day massacre because it happened on February 14th. And after doing this, Capone gains the upper hand and really chases Bugsy Moran out of Chicago. Don't worry, the story ends all right because Moran goes out to a little place in Nevada and kind of creates Las Vegas. So there's all sorts of stuff going on here, right? But that is where we see Al Capone really gain control over a lot of the alcohol distribution in the United States. Now that is being imported. A lot of the alcohol is being imported from Canada or brought in, smuggled in on ships and that sort of thing. But we're producing our own, especially in places like the South, in Kentucky and Tennessee, in places like Appalachia, because they're making moonshine and whiskey in these stills, right? And they are going to then use those to supply their own needs or supplement their income and sell to friends and neighbors, or really big operations may even have some contacts in the organized crime world to be able to distribute that on a larger scale. So it is still being produced, although not by major manufacturers, and it's also being smuggled in as well. What we're going to see is that it's often distributed through what we call speakeasies. These are illegal clubs or bars that serve alcohol, and they had to be well hidden. They weren't advertised. This was kind of word of mouth only, and they got really good at being able to hide the alcohol even in these bars, because if they got raided, they could be shut down. So you often had to know a password, and the doorman would really kind of stall to give a few minutes to the people on the inside so that they could pour the alcohol out, get rid of it, hide it. There were often secret panels or ways to really quickly get rid of the alcohol, and really fascinating kind of culture develops around that. But oftentimes they would come into these places and there would be no alcohol on premises. Where just a few minutes ago, everybody was drinking and carrying on. Now it's just a social club. People are listening to music and having a meal and just kind of gathering in that way. Now, if they do get caught, you're going to see federal agents. Their job is to try to stop organized crime, raid speakeasies, break up distribution rings. So here we see a keg of beer that is being poured into the sewer, overseen by federal agents after a raid. And that was not terribly uncommon either. Although many of the raids didn't turn anything up because police officers who were being paid to inform when and where meant that people often had a heads up and could move the alcohol before it was discovered. So a lot of things going on here. We also had, again, with these federal agents, you saw guys like Eliot Ness, and he's not the only one, but probably one of the more famous out of Chicago, and he is charged with kind of bringing down Capone. He puts together a group called that become nicknamed the Untouchables because they're supposed to be incorruptible. And so it's a very, very small group. Chicago police force at that time was notorious for being on the take, but Ness and his guys couldn't be bought. They were kind of fearless. And in fact, they kind of adopted many of the tactics of some of these ruthless gang members. But anyway, we see them become kind of national heroes for their fight against organized crime, especially when organized crime kind of erupted into wars with one another. It's one thing when it is quietly in the shadows delivering a product that we want. It's another thing when that spills over into violence. And so Eliot Ness becomes really a national hero for helping to try to put a cap on that. As I said before, Americans get really, really good at trying to hide their alcohol. And so I'm going to show a few pictures here because I think it's very interesting. You've got women here who she's showing off that she's got these containers here with alcohol that can be covered by longer coats and so forth. And no policeman in their right mind is going to stop a woman and pat her down for fear of that obviously being taken the wrong way and being wrong. So she just walks about the streets delivering her wares to wherever they're needed to go. Here we see a little bit more sophisticated means of distribution. This truck that looks like a lumber truck, right? A lumber delivery truck, but it's hollow inside. It just looks like that from the outside. And instead, there's all sorts of alcohol, boxes of bottles, kegs of beer, whatever the case may be. And it can drive around in plain sight because it's being hidden in what looks like a lumberyard truck. Here we see a woman at home showing off kind of how she hides some of her alcohol, or maybe, to take a book to read in public, and yet there's a bottle disguised inside the book that she can easily access. And then finally, there's all sorts of examples where furniture has false compartments or panels that can be removed. This is a Victrola, kind of an old record player, but the back comes off of it, and here we see all sorts of bottles of alcohol stored there. I've got one example that I want to show you because this is from the 1920s, and it's just very simply a set of binoculars. But and if you feel on there, it feels like binoculars, but when you open it up, it's actually a flask. Now the glass is actually shaped the way binoculars would be with a center knob, but obviously you can carry more than enough alcohol for a day's hike and bird watch. You know what I mean? So just examples like that all over the place. In the 1920s, people used canes. They would have harnesses where they could have bladders of alcohol that would hang around their body. All sorts of different ways of disguising that and hiding that. We got really good at it. To that end, it's also the roots of NASCAR. As I spoke about the stills earlier, if you're making large amounts of it and you need to transport it to other counties or to a major city to be purchased and distributed by your underworld contacts, you need to be able to transport that. Well, liquid is heavy. And so if you load a whole bunch of it into a car, that car's springs are going to compress and it's going to ride very low. And that's one of the things that law enforcement really looked for, was a car with a single driver or two people in it that seemed to be unusually heavy. They would get pulled over and searched, and the alcohol would be seized. The drivers would be arrested and the cars would be impounded. So what they began to do is they began to get drivers and mechanics that would remove all sorts of excess weight. They'd beef up the springs so that when you added the extra weight of the alcohol into hidden compartments, the weight was such that it rode at about the same level as a car should with only one driver or one passenger. Then they began to really soup the car's engines up to make little improvements so that if they had to outrun the police, if they had to outrun the law, they could do so. And then it became a thing of pride about whose car was the fastest. And so you started seeing these racing circuits that were being dominated by still owners or people who were running these illegal moonshine, stills and so forth. And so it was out of that tinkering with the automobiles to make them lighter, to make them faster, and yet to make them seem as though they are just like every other car on the road, is where we see kind of the roots of that NASCAR racing circuit really begin. Now, one other thing we see about this time period is that a lot of companies that had been beer manufacturers or alcohol producers are going to really struggle. What do they do when they can no longer create the product that they're famous for and what they're so good at? And the reality is a good number of those go out of businesses. Bars have to try to find ways to make a living by becoming restaurants, to kind of shift just a little bit. Here we see a truck from the Miller Brewing Company, right? Miller High Life. But they're making other types of beverages, sodas or malt syrups. So all sorts of different ways that they were going to try to shift their business model to use the equipment that they had to make other things that could keep them in business. A lot of these companies really struggled for about 14 years to continue to retain their employees and stay in business. And a lot of them failed. There were a lot that really went under during that time. A lot of jobs were lost in the brewing industry and so forth. We will see that from the very beginning, as soon as the 18th Amendment is passed, there is a movement underway to try to get it repealed. It takes a long time. It was a long time coming to get the 18th passed. Now to repeal it is going to take a while as well. And so here we see signs and banners help the president with law enforcement repeal the 18th Amendment. They felt like repealing it would boost the economy, that repealing it would create jobs, that repealing it would mean that you're undermining the major funding source for organized crime. So it's going to help reduce violence and so forth. And ultimately, they're probably right. This was a terribly failed experiment, an infringement upon liberties. It was done in the very best faith, I think, but in the end, it was not really congruent with our beliefs as a nation about personal rights, responsibilities, and freedoms. And so it's ultimately going to be repealed. It is going to be repealed in 1933 with the passage of the 21st Amendment. That's the only time in American history where we've had to write an amendment that basically said, you remember that other amendment? Never mind, right? We just took an eraser to it. So that's what the 21st Amendment is. And here we see it being celebrated on December 5th when people can have a drink. Again, that was in the midst of the Depression, and the nation really needed a drink. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure that you subscribe, like the video, and leave me any comments. I'd love to hear about you. I'd love to hear from you. This is such an incredibly rich and interesting topic. So let me know what you think. Thanks, guys.